Lesson 3.2. Welcome, grade 8s. In today's lesson, we are going to learn all about the rebirth of ideas. Which ideas from the classical times helped to form the Renaissance humanist worldview? So stick around and let's learn something. Which ideas from classical times helped to form the Renaissance humanist worldview? This is lesson 3.2. So, what is humanism? Well, this is all part of a rebirth of learning. And the word humanism, it comes from the Latin word humanitas to refer to the quality of the human mind that sets us apart from animals. So this is our spiritual and our intellectual abilities. Spoiler alert, we are different from animals. And the kind of advancement of this all came about during the Renaissance, when people were taking a look at human beings and their potential. And where did this start? Well, it's no surprise that this all started in the Italian city-states, specifically in the northern Italian city-states, because this is where the money was. And if you had money, you could focus on other things than trying to get food, and without trying to have shelter, and without having to meet your basic needs. And you can start kind of thinking about, hey, what else is important? And you get to start spending your time. Maybe you'll pick up a hobby or things like that. Well, back then, these scholars, we call them now humanists, they were taking a look at the classic ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. It was the classical writings that our humanists are going to be most interested in. So those will be your Greek and your Roman writings. Not only that, they're also going to take a look at Greek and Roman art, architecture, and all that kind of stuff. And what they'll do, humanists, what they'll do is they'll take these writings, they'll take this art, they'll take these ideas, and they will apply those ideas into their own lives and into their own work. So this is, so they're not really stealing ideas. I guess they're stealing ideas, but they're taking those ideas and they're applying it to their daily lives. Now, you need to remember the Black Death. The Black Death, we always come back to this Black Death. We're in chapter 3 and we're still coming back to it. They didn't forget about the Greek and the Roman civilizations during that time. Okay, it was very much alive and at the forefront, but they were dealing with a lot of issues during this time, and it wasn't really like super duper front and center, but it still was there in their daily lives. Okay. Like the church, for example. Latin was still being used by the church. And because of that, people needed to know Latin. They needed to be able to read and write. And they used that to kind of continue on with their lives during the Middle Ages. Because the church was in Latin, they studied all of the work of the Greeks and the Romans from a Christian perspective, because the church was still very much central in their lives. During this period of time of the Renaissance, education was still really important, and they started taking a look at these works of the Greeks and the Romans in a different way. They started taking a look at the eloquent writing. They started taking a look at the society and the politics, the history and the arts of the Greeks and the Romans. And they're like, hey, you know what? This was a great time to be alive. So why don't we use some of these ideas, some of these writing styles, some of these ideas about society and history? Why don't we use them in our present day? And because of that, now, it wasn't one person thinking this. It was a whole group thinking this during a similar time. And because of that, our Renaissance worldview is that intercultural contact with those earlier classical civilizations. The classical civilizations are of the Greeks and of the Romans, okay? And they were using those ideas to further advance their modern day. I'm using air quotations again. You can't see it through my microphone, but I've got modern civilization, modern society in air quotations, because for them, living in that time was the modern time. So how did we have this intercultural contact with earlier civilizations when the Black Death was happening and all that kind of stuff? Well, I want you to think back to chapter 2 and when we talked about the Crusades and when we talked about the trade. There were two important results of the Crusades. One was trade, the other was contact with Muslim civilizations. And that's exactly who preserved the knowledge of the classical civilizations. It was the Islamic society and their civilizations that preserved this knowledge of all of this, of all the Romans and the Greeks. So they took this knowledge and they studied it and they became experts of it. And once you become an expert at something, you can use that information to further develop other areas of your life. So in this situation, it was that in the sciences, math, medicine. Even then, I wouldn't be sure I would trust medicine from the Renaissance. I look back even 20 years ago and there were some things that were maybe kind of like questionable. But they use these ideas to further develop advancements in science, math, and medicine in India, in the Far East, and they've just built on these ideas. And these ideas made their way back to Europe. And back to what I was originally saying a few minutes ago, when you have money and you don't have to struggle to meet your basic needs, you start to develop some hobbies. Each one of us has hobbies. Maybe it's making these YouTube lesson videos that I have for you guys that are learning from home. Or maybe it's photography, or maybe it's video games, or maybe it's exercise or cooking. Who knows what your hobbies could be? But when you're not having to worry about your basic needs, you can focus on your hobbies. And that's what humanists did. This spread amongst the wealthy people in northern Italy because they didn't have to worry about those basic needs. So they're sitting in the piazzas and they're having their coffee and things like that, and they are reading and they're discussing ancient writers. Like, that was the thing to do. So something, if you go to the mall right now, for example, and you want to do some people watching, what are people talking about? Right? Like, they're talking about, maybe, obviously, they're talking about pandemics, yes, but they could be talking about sports, they could be talking about technology. Oftentimes, you will see them on their cell phones, or their cell phone will be on their table. Like, this was the thing to do back then. The thing was to talk about the classics. Much like today, the thing to do is, to update your Snapchat stories or whatever it's called, and check out Instagram and do those kinds of things. TikTok, it's a fad. And back then, the fad was to discuss these ancient writers. And they developed a set of rules or commandments that would guide people's behavior. And we see this from a Christian point of view. We see this with our 10 commandments. So they're talking about these things, okay? So here are the 10 commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of your God. Remember the Sabbath, keeping it holy. Honor mom and dad, your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Now, these were written down. And humanists, they would, because they were Christian, they would study these things and they would try and apply these to their modern way of life. So why are we looking at the classics? Why are we looking at the Greeks and the Romans? Well, the Greeks and the Romans were a time that should have been celebrated. And during this Renaissance time, now remember the Renaissance, they didn't wake up and say, hey, it's the Renaissance, Mario and Luigi, like John Green says, let's go and celebrate the Renaissance. They couldn't help but constantly think about the Greeks and the Romans because the achievements of the Greeks and the Romans were absolutely everywhere, okay? And even today, like, the achievements of the Greeks and the Romans are still in existence. If you go to Greece, If you go to Athens, you'll see those Greek ruins. If you go to other parts of Europe, you'll see the ruins of the Romans, like the Colosseum. Like there's still lots of aqueducts, the roads. Picture here of Hadrian's Wall in England. Like, just because these civilizations no longer existed doesn't mean that you couldn't see them every single day by just like walking around in your city and things like that. Humanism and the individual. The most important idea, the most important concept of all of these thinkers during this time was that of the belief and dignity and the belief in the dignity and the potential of the individual. Humanists believed that people could shape their lives through their own efforts and talents. And we see that at the end of chapter 1 when feudalism falls. If you want to work hard, you will make money, you will move out of a peasant class. That's how that feudalism collapsed. And humanists went further and they believed, hey, yeah, you want to change your life? You are able to do that. Okay? Now, they were still doing this from a Christian perspective because this fit perfectly within a Christian worldview. Humanists said, if you go and develop your talents, you are serving God. You are serving God because God provided you with those talents. So this fit perfect with the church's teachings. This fit perfect with that Christian worldview. And that's saying that's true for all of you. If you have an athletic ability, well, from a Christian perspective, you would be going against God's, you would not be serving God because then you're not harnessing that athletic ability. Some of you can play instruments. You're very talented with that. Some of you can dance. Some of you can sing. Many of you can draw. If you don't harness these abilities, if you don't go forward and run with these, then you are wasting the talents that God has given you. So from a Renaissance perspective, from a humanist perspective, this fit perfectly with that of the Christian perspective at that time. Humanists believed in 4 things. Now, these 4 things are super important. And as I'm going through this, think for yourself, like, is this something that you also believe in? So these are the 4 things that they kind of figured out, and this is what they were doing. Number 1, humans have the power of reason, which means you have the ability to think and find your own truths. You can do that. Number 2, humanists believe that it's important for a person to have an open, curious, and questioning mind. Okay? The only way you're going to learn things is if you ask questions. The only way you're going to ask questions is if you are curious about something. The only way you're going to get answers is if you are open to hearing those answers. Number 3, the third thing that humanists believe, people can achieve great things through learning. Back then, it was through books and through discussions. Today, it's the very same thing, except we've added Google and YouTube to that. You can go to iFixit, and you can achieve great things through learning. Like, you can learn all of these things. I mentioned earlier that this is on YouTube. This is on YouTube because there's other teachers that are putting out their lessons on there, because you can learn and you can achieve great things just by the willingness to learn. And number 4, the fourth thing that humanists believe is individuals should be skilled in many different areas. Okay, so develop not just your mind. Don't just be smart, although that is fantastic, but you also need to develop and be skilled in your body and your spirit as well. You need to take care of your body will take care of your mind. You need to take care of your spirit because your spirit will take care of your mind and your body. All 3 of those work together. And it's a very Christian perspective as well, because these are the gifts and these are the things that God gives you. Now, you've heard of the term Dark Ages before, and it came from this guy, Francesco Petrarch. And he said that the classics, the Greeks and the Romans, That was the time to be alive. This is when we should have been alive. Not now. We should have been alive during the times of the Romans and the Greeks, and the Greeks and the Romans, because that time was glorious. And he called their current living conditions the Dark Ages. And we've seen this before. And he is often known as the father of the Renaissance, the father of humanism, this Francesco Petrarch. And we will hear about him a little bit later. So you're this humanist, and you agree with Francesco, you agree with Petrarch, and yeah, we're living in the Dark Ages. And now it's time for us to be reborn. And we need to take a look at the Renaissance as a whole, even though they didn't wake up thinking, hey, this is the Renaissance. They said, you know what? Our time is also a very good time. And now we are going to be reborn. So the Muslim world, we know this, they preserved the Greek and the Roman manuscripts. They preserved monasteries and cathedrals around Europe, not just the Muslims, but the Europeans did too. And they started noticing individually, and that becomes collective knowledge, they started noticing these classics from a different point of view. And when we take a look at these manuscripts and these writings, well, it became something to collect. Some of you collect hockey cards. Some of you are currently maybe collecting whatever Tim Hortons is giving out or McDonald's is giving out. We're collecting these things, right? Well, humanists, they were collecting manuscripts. So they were collecting the writing of the Greeks and the Romans. And they were collecting them not for their own personal gain, but they wanted to share these manuscripts with the world and with the people around them. They wanted people to read these manuscripts. They wanted as many people as possible to follow in their humanist ideas, those four things that they believed in. They wanted to reach as many people as possible because they believed that if you wanted to be a cultured individual, you need to read good books and you need to look at good works of art. How do you feel about that? Here in Edmonton, we have a very strong arts scene, and we have people that are constantly arguing about art. Some people will talk about from a financial point of view or from an aesthetics point of view. But do you agree with that? To be cultured, you need to read good books and you need to look at good works of art. Well, back then, that's what humanists believed, and they wanted to make these good books and these works of art accessible to everybody. So they went and they translated them into their own language, into the vernacular, that's a vocabulary word, so that it could reach the masses. But there's a problem. People were still having to meet their basic needs, and this was only really working for the wealthy people so that they could spend the time to do these kinds of things. Okay, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete this part of the chapter.